The aura of our world is no longer sacred. We no longer have the sacred horizon of appearances, but that of the absolute commodity. Its essence is promotional. At the heart of our universe is an evil genius of advertising, a trickster who has absorbed the drollery of the commodity, dragging the world into a phantasmagoria of which we are all the fascinated victims. So I wanted to start off tonight's talk with this quote by a French philosopher, sociologist, Jean Baudrillard, who happens to be an atheist. Why start a talk about the Incarnation, about how to live our faith in a simulated virtual world with the ideas of an atheist? I think because it really brings home the fact that, so many of us, not just believers, but all human beings, really feel that, we've lost this sense of life having some ultimate purpose, some meaning. We feel alienated from reality, from each other, from our own lives. So Baudrillard, whose films inspired The Matrix, other films like The Truman Show, these kind of VR, these films that try to imagine what would it be like if VR took over everything, made everything into a simulation. He goes as far as saying that reality, which is no longer a sacramental sign pointing us to something transcendent, but it has become this simulation. It's become this endless collection of hollow images and sensational spectacles. So even celebrities who are kind of like the new exalted deities, the gods and goddesses of our simulated spectacular age, they can see that there's something empty about the cultural zeitgeist of today. So if we take Bad Bunny, who's a Puerto Rican singer, he's topped the Spotify global year-end charts 3 times now. Bad Bunny said, and again, this is someone who's kind of steeped in this, the culture that we're in. His music is always about these kind of decadent themes, going to parties, going wild. And also his public persona it's heavily shaped by social media trends, by highly politicized ideological kind of discourse. But even he, in his songs, breaks out of character. He admits that there's something off, something kind of absurd about this social ethos that we're in, this social ethos in which his own career is kind of entrenched in. Who am I? I don't know. I forgot, he sings in one of his 2018 songs called Rolandito. And he compares the trajectory of his own life, his career, to a driver whose GPS has stopped working. Fame is not all it's cracked up to be. Love is short-lived. As people die, they turn their backs on us. Or in the case of romance, the sentiments eventually fizzle out. He questions whether he should seek answers in the stars, using astrology. Should he turn to God himself? But he concludes at the end of the song that he still doesn't know who he is and he doesn't know where to go in life. And the title of this song, Rolandito, is taking the name from this kid in Puerto Rico who went missing in the 90s and was never found. So a really kind of powerful way to convey this sense that not only has he lost sight of where he's going in his career, but he can't even find himself. He doesn't know what his identity is anymore. Really powerful way to kind of think of the experience of being entrenched in this virtual, simulated world. So in our discussion tonight, I'd like us to thoughtfully, discerningly, prayerfully consider the question of what we as believers should do in the midst of a cultural and political ethos that has largely forgotten God, forgotten reality itself, and that's dominated by the virtual. So my blunt answer to this question of what we should do is nothing. I say this as someone who happens to find pleasure in inciting provocation. So when I say nothing, take it with a grain of salt. I don't mean it literally. So when I say that the answer is to do nothing, I'm not saying that we should just throw our hands in the air and just give ourselves over to apathy. Rather, I mean that we should do nothing the same way that the Virgin Mary did when she humbly received the gift of being chosen to give birth to the Son of God. The same way the shepherds did when they simply appeared as they were and allowed themselves to receive the gift of God being born in the flesh in that lowly stable. The same way Jesus himself refused to engage with the devil's attempts to lead him into temptation. In the same way he told the disciples that evil is driven out not through direct confrontation with it, but through fasting and prayer. And in the same way Mary Magdalene waited patiently by the tomb for her beloved to appear to her once again. Thus, my proposal to do nothing is not something passive, it's active. It's an ascetic or even a monastic nothingness. It's full of longing and expectation. Better put, it's a form of receptivity. It's, in the words of the French philosopher Simone Weil, waiting for God, who promises to reveal himself in the flesh, to enter into the reality in which we're living and to surprise us in ways that we would never expect, to guide us and show us the way forward. So it's a radical trust coming from the recognition that the solution to our postmodern virtual world, it's not in our hands. Inspiring us to keep our eyes out and our attention sharpened on the ways that God might incarnate himself in our virtual age of spectacles and simulations. So before continuing, I want to offer a word of caution. It's tempting when faced with people, public figures, politicians, media outlets that promote ideas that directly contradict our beliefs and our values, and to assume this kind of reactionary position. As the sense of the sacred continues dissipating from our cultural fabric, and we're made to feel powerless, ignored, disrespected, we may feel the urge to do whatever we can to fight against this current. This is likely the case for those of us who have children or those who educate kids, who want to protect them from ideas that will confuse and corrupt them, and that will lead them away from the plan God has for their flourishing in this life and the next. But when faced with this urge to resist, to fight back and to react, I'd warn us not to be naive about it. The reactionary posture is driven by our own strength and our own intelligence. It's based on a solution of our own making. So as our postmodern ethos has already proven, man-made things, man-made solutions, they usually fail to hold up. The reactionary posture fights fire with fire, we could say, a godless solution to a problem of godlessness. Unless the Lord builds the house, the psalmist warns us, our labor will be in vain. So this isn't to say that there aren't times when prudence and charity will call for us to take a definitive and unequivocal stand on certain issues. Sometimes we do have to speak out. Again, for those who have kids or those teaching kids, we know that part of loving them means that we have to correct them when they're wrong. And needless to say, there's a big difference between doing so for the sake of protecting them versus for the sake of exerting our own power or doing it out of spite. Similarly, there are times when we'll need to resist, to say no, to push against certain things that directly contradict our faith. But there's a difference between doing it out of this impulsive reaction versus out of a prudential decision born of discernment, born of prayer. One that's centered on God's initiative rather than our own initiative, God's plan rather than our own. There's a difference between taking a stand on an issue in the name of defending our beliefs, defending our faction and culture war, we could call it, versus wanting to protect and care for our neighbors out of love. Ultimately, we have to accept that God doesn't need us to protect him. His truth is eternal. His power is greater than any earthly or spiritual enemy. And I think this same principle applies when we're looking at our own lifestyles, our own how we are living day-to-day lives. So if we take the example of our phones, the kind of center of everything virtual, who has a smartphone? Let's start with that. Who actually has a smartphone? Let's say vast majority. Who would say honestly that they're kind of addicted? They use it way too much. Yeah, it's normal. It's we don't have to be embarrassed anymore, but we know it's not something that helps us. I think this same mentality of wanting to fight against it, wanting to control ourselves and stop ourselves from doom scrolling endlessly. I mean, the reality is that it usually doesn't work. When we say, I'm gonna put this reminder, it's that the timer's gonna go off when I'm scrolling after 15 minutes, and then you swipe it away and you keep going. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So again, this idea that I'm gonna rely on my strength, my power to fight against, whether it's the problems out there in society or in how I'm living my life, it doesn't work. This is why I'm saying let's not be naive. Let's look at the reality of our limitations as human beings and say, okay, well, how can I let God take the initiative in the way I'm living my own life, in the way I'm engaging in our society, with all the limitations, all the problems that we're facing. So then what does it look like to live this position of receptivity, of waiting on the incarnation, for God to surprise us in the mess of our postmodern age of spectacles and simulations? So I'm going to propose 2 attitudes, 2 practices, and 2 goals for our consideration tonight. So the first attitude, or we could even call it a spiritual disposition, is the most basic. It's prayerfulness, engaging in prayer. Prayerfulness surely includes forms of private and communal prayer, whether that's reading the scripture, attending the liturgy, going to mass. But it also involves developing an attitude of self-awareness and discernment of spirits, an attentiveness to the inner promptings of our psyche, our mind, as well as our soul, and the signs that God is trying to show us in our encounters and experiences every day. So I'm currently reading this book by, it was a monk from Greece who was recently canonized in the Orthodox Church. And he always had people coming to him for advice. And there was this one mother whose son, I think he was like 5 years old, but he was always causing issues. He was a mess, always disobeying her. And she was trying to really, instill some discipline in this kid, but he never listened. So she went with the kid to see this monk. And she said, my kid won't listen to me. He's disobedient. He's disrespectful. And while she's talking to the monk, this kid starts running around just being, ridiculous in a monastery, the worst place of all places to do that. And he said to her, don't respond to the kid. Just pay attention to me and don't look at what he's doing. She's like, no, but he's yelling and screaming in this monastery. I have to tell him to stop. And he's like, this is the problem. You're raising him relying on your own power. You're looking at what you have to do to keep him under control. Instead, you need to focus on your spiritual life. If you focus on your relationship with God, developing your own sanctity, you might be surprised by how your kid's behavior changes. So she starts doing this. She starts ignoring him when he's acting up, and she just prays. She entrusts it to God. And seemingly miraculously, the kid calms down. He gets tired of nagging her because he sees she's not going to react. So, it's an idealistic example. I don't recommend that you with kids try it because, I don't know, unless you're a saint already, it's not going to work. But in principle, we can follow this, that when we're faced with some kind of difficulty, whether it's our kids, our family members, issues at work, in society, do we approach it with what am I going to do to control it, to fix it, or I'm going to entrust this to God? I'm going to see what he calls me to do in this situation. So again, developing this disposition of prayerfulness, of really paying attention to the signs. What is God asking of me? What is he trying to do in my life right now? So the second attitude is one of building up a playful sense of humor. So one of the greatest proponents of this modern individualist mentality is the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche ended his life depressed, kind of deranged, and alone. And I'll admit that I'm a big fan of his. I think he had a lot of genuine insights. And, I have a real sympathy for the ending of his life, that he was alone and really sad. But I think this is the inevitable result if we build our lives completely on, putting everything on our own shoulders, trying to resolve everything by ourselves as individuals. So when I encounter people of faith who have a dour or an overly serious temperament, people who are always frustrated, always busy criticizing others or even criticizing themselves, I made to question, are they placing their hope in an all-powerful, all-loving God, or are they, like Nietzsche, placing all their hope on themselves? So humor, it's born of the recognition of contradictions or of paradoxes. Whenever we watch a good stand-up comedian, it's because they notice those contradictory things about everyday life, about humanity, and they're able to make a joke out of it. And Christians, we're no stranger to paradoxes. We believe in a God who became a human being. So when we really think about it, it doesn't make any sense. How could an all-powerful, infinite being enter into the world as a baby, not only as a human baby, but in a stable in the middle of nowhere? It doesn't make any sense. But also this idea that we have a sinless deity who's tortured and killed for our sins, who loves us infinitely, even if we deny him 3 or more times. This image of Peter, it's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense that this guy just keeps betraying him and that Jesus forgives him anyway. Our faith is full of paradoxes. There's something ridiculous about it all when we take a step back and think about it. But if we're not capable of laughing at ourselves, how are we supposed to be able to enjoy the hundredfold that Christ promised us? If we don't have a sense of humor, how can we develop the humility to receive God's grace in our lives? So there's this interplay between humor and humility, being able to laugh, being able to not take ourselves too seriously, and not being able to receive God's grace, to be graceful with others, to be merciful with others' shortcomings. This self-seriousness is a sign of, again, this disproportionate trust in ourselves, while self-deprecation, being able to crack a joke on ourselves, is a sign of this kind of trusting attitude, this sense that there's something bigger than me. It's not all on my shoulders. So the next time that we're mad at the world, or even that we're mad at ourselves, we want to criticize ourselves, I think it's much better to start by cracking a joke about the situation. Pray, but also learn how to laugh. It's not all that serious. So after these two attitudes of prayerfulness and playfulness, having a sense of humor and discerning the spirits, the signs that God is trying to show us, I want us to consider 2 practices that can help us to live this receptivity to the Incarnation in our simulational age. The first one I want to draw on the work of a philosopher named Matthew Crawford. So this guy studied philosophy. He got a job in academia, got his PhD, was teaching, found that to be really dry and boring. Then he got an office job, got this, kind of corporate job. And again, that was even more boring. Those of you who work in corporate America, I'm sure you know what that's like. But then he's like, okay, I'm done. Like, I studied all these fascinating ideas about the meaning of life, about human nature. I want to do something hands-on. I want to do something that actually engages with life in the flesh. So one of the things he discovered as he left behind academia, corporate America, and got into the field of fixing motorcycles, from philosophy to fixing motorcycles. I mean, it's a kind of ridiculous career trajectory. He started to understand the importance of cultivating one's attention, especially today when there are so many things competing for our attention. Again, first thing is this. On top of what we see on the news, on top of, I don't know, like there are a million things trying to compete for our attention. And he understood that it's not a matter of self-control. It's not a matter of like, I have to shut all these things out and just focus on what matters most. Because again, we're limited. We're weak as humans. We're going to fall back into those patterns, those habits all over again. So it's not a matter of trying to control where we place our attention. It's a matter of asking a question. Not how do I pay attention, but where is my attention right now? See the difference between trying to force yourself to do something and starting with that question. Where is my attention? What am I looking at? Am I looking at my phone? Am I doom scrolling? Why am I doing that? What else is going on around me that's competing for my attention? I think about it, I mean, this is my first time in Georgia, so I mean, it's a little bit of a culture shock coming down from New York. So there's a lot of things grabbing my attention around here. And sure, plenty of moments when I'm walking around and I'm checking my phone, but it's very easy to get distracted from the phone because there's so many fascinating sights around me. So I don't know, I mean, if you start with like the vegetation, I was saying, to Father Jonathan, like the Spanish moss, like I've never seen anything like this before. Why does it exist? Like, why? No, really, like, why did God make it? Like, to me as a New Yorker, it's really beautiful just walking around. This stuff is hanging. It's fascinating. So like, why would God put that there? There's no like, I'm sure there's some evolutionary reason, whatever, but like ultimately, like, why does God put beautiful things in our path every day? It's a sign that somebody thinks of us. But even with man-made things, like when we go into the church, like if you look at the altar, the woodwork, like all these intricate details, why would somebody put in all the work to do that? I mean, they don't have to. They could just put the altar and you still do the liturgy. It's the same thing. But the fact that somebody took the time to really, carve out these painstaking, all these little details, again, it's a sign that they're not just trying to get a job done. There's a sign of something gratuitous. There's this love that goes into that kind of work. It makes me think of there's a cathedral in Barcelona, Spain, Sagrada Familia, which they've been building for over 100 years, and they're still not done with it. But one of the most fascinating things about this cathedral is that at the very top, there are these spires that have like, I think they carve like fruit, and it was supposed to be like an offering. They're offering food. They're offering creation back to God. But you can't see it if you're on the ground. Like you need to have like a drone or like go in a helicopter. So why would you put all the time, energy, money into carving these tiny, minuscule details that no human is really going to see? Sure, God's going to see it, but you don't have to put in all that extra work. Again, it's a sign that you recognize that your work is not just for getting a paycheck or getting a job done. It's because there's something beautiful to offer yourself, to know that you really put your energy into something that means something to you. So again, I think this is the first thing, not trying to regulate our attention, but asking, where is it? And what else is around me? What else is competing for my attention? Why are all these things around here? Like what signs of beauty are surrounding me? I do the same thing when I'm teaching. I teach college freshmen right now. And obviously, the AI, the ChatGPT thing it's a real problem for anyone in education right now. And I try to use the same mentality rather than scare them and saying, I'm going to use this AI detector and I'm going to fail you if you plagiarize. I start by saying, okay, why are you even here in college in the first place? What are you doing here? Because you want to get a credential and you want to get a job and make enough money, and then you're going to die. I mean, that's the reality. It's like, why are you wasting your time going to college just to get your credential and then die? Is there something worth your time? Like, is there something really here that's meaningful other than getting your bachelor's degree? Is there something beautiful about studying whatever it is in your class, whether it's a theology class, whether it's science, literature, history? So that when you start to write your paper, it's not just how do I get this job done? How do I put the prompt into ChatGPT and it gives me something? And again, usually you can tell if they're using ChatGPT because it's like it never says anything. Like it says information, but it's not really saying anything. So you're going to fail anyway. But still, again, like as a student, you should be asking yourself, why am I doing this work? Is it just to get it done, or am I trying to learn something about life, about reality? Starting with the question rather than a regulation, rather than an imposition on our will. And just to kind of round that up, this philosopher, Matthew Crawford, when he started working on motorcycles, he just had this kind of, I don't know, it was this life-changing experience for him because he realized that unlike academia or a corporate job, the value of your work is measured by your attentiveness to the actual thing that you're doing. Like in order to fix a motorcycle, you need to know all the different parts of the motorcycle. You need to know why this part may be malfunctioning. You have to actually love the thing in front of you in order to get the job done. And if you don't, like if you're not really cultivating this attention, this love for your work, then you're not going to be able to fix it and you're not going to get paid. It's different for those of us who have jobs who you publish a paper or you get some deal to go through and then they pay you and then you work your way up in the ranks. He recognized that those kinds of hands-on jobs, like it's reality itself that rewards you. And I think this is, a beautiful kind of, I guess, a metaphor for the incarnation that, if it's true that God enters into the actual human world, we can see that beauty, we can see that truth, we can see meaning when we do these things, engaging with our hands, engaging with the physical world itself. So that's not to say to leave your office job if that's what you do and go start fixing bikes or building whatever. But again, I think in principle, we should all look for ways to actually be doing stuff with our hands, like to engage reality in the flesh, because that is the most concrete way that we can see that kind of beauty that like God, Jesus himself was a carpenter who was working with his hands. So what are the ways that we can get our hands dirty, that we can actually be doing physical things again? So the other practice, in addition to, kind of cultivating our attention, really starting to use our hands again, I want to pull from St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians when he said to test everything and retain what's good. So if Christ incarnates himself in reality, that means even in the darkest corners of our society, he's present, even if it's in a very minuscule way. Thus, it's important for us to develop an approach of prudent engagement with popular culture, of a matured, kind of detached curiosity that seeks to identify nuggets of truth wherever they may be around us. So while prudence may require us to shut out certain forms of culture, that would do objective harm to us, especially if we know we have certain weaknesses. I'm not going to go look for Christ in a gentleman's club or in a trap house. That's not what I'm advocating for. No, but we should aspire to have a general openness to engage with as much of the culture as we can. And surely young people should be more cautious when doing this. Mature adults will have a better way of kind of, of being prudent, of making more better judgments. But again, we should aim to inculcate in young people this capacity for prudential engagement. So rather, for those, again, people who have kids, rather than simply banning them from watching something like Euphoria or 13 Reasons Why, or listening to death metal, whatever it may be, really teaching them to ask questions about what they're interested in, to have a kind of reasoned engagement with the culture around them. And I alluded at the beginning of this talk, to pop culture, to pop music. I'm a big pop culture junkie. I grew up on pop music, TV, celebrity gossip. That's the norm in the area of Jersey where I grew up, and we're a little trashy over there, but but we're proud of it anyway. So no, when I came to faith, tossing pop culture out the window wasn't an option because that's all I knew. Like that's what I grew up on. But I've come to discover that even in mass-produced, kind of decadent, self-indulgent forms of pop culture, like the Kardashians or whatever, even those speak of certain spiritual truths that, if you know how to pay close attention to them, you'll find something true there. You'll find even a little hint of truth. And especially if we listen to pop music today, especially the love songs or the breakup songs, they always speak of some profound longing, of this search for something, the search for meaning, for lasting love, for redemption in their suffering. There's this vulnerability that shows this, I don't know, kind of like St. Augustine, who talks about the restlessness of the heart. Like if you really listen closely to pop music, you'll see there's a restlessness. Even if they look for the answers in the wrong places, I think we can still appreciate, I don't know, like there's something deeply human about what they're trying to convey. Again, using caution, using prudence. Sorry. So after these two practices of, cultivating attention, really paying attention to the reality around us, but also being open to engaging, looking for truth, even in things that aren't ideal. I want us to think about two longer-term goals that we should have our eyes and our hearts set on. And I want to take what Christ says in the Gospel of John, that his desire he has, that they may all be one, that all people may be united, as our point of departure. I think ultimately what our long-term goals should be in our current cultural context is first to build local community, but also to build bridges across ideological divides. So the goal of building local community is bolstered by the attitudes and the practices that I already mentioned. The foundation of a strong community is rooted in self-awareness. It's rooted in prayer. So Dorothy Day, who is a social activist, she founded the Catholic Worker Movement. She saw community as a space where we share our loneliness, our suffering, our brokenness, our spiritual longing with each other. And this is in the place where God reveals himself as the answer to this loneliness. So it's not so much that we look to the other to kind of solve our loneliness, to fix our problems, but we share it. We shoulder the burden with each other and see God acting in our midst through our unity. Community is a place both where we worship God and we share our joys with each other, but it's also a place where we shoulder our burdens, like I said, offering consolation and correction to each other, helping each other to grow. But even beyond the spiritual level, it's the place where we support each other's material needs and endeavors as well. It's a place where we can learn the skills like the ones I mentioned before, where we build things for the sake of the common good, where we collaborate to respond to the needs of society. I think this is especially crucial in light of the uprooting effect of mass media, especially with our phones, but also with the kind of ideological polemics that we see in the media, in the news, on our feeds, in our age of simulation. So I wanted to cite the sociologist Musa Al-Gharbi. He wrote a book recently, which I recommend to everyone. It's a really incredible book. But he writes, so in 1983, roughly 90% of all media were controlled by 50 companies. So think about that. 1983, not that long ago, 90% of the media controlled by 50 companies. By 2012, that stat had been reduced to 6 companies. So from 1983 to 2012, 50 companies now controlled by 6 companies. Even local newspapers and television conglomerates, he says, are increasingly being bought up by huge conglomerates. These consolidations have led to a significant decline in coverage of local issues and the issues that locals care about. Local and state news has largely been replaced with nationalized and centralized news, contributing to what he calls the nationalization of politics. So by a show of hands, who knows who just ran on the Republican and Democratic ticket for president? Everybody should know who ran as a Republican and Democrat for president. Who knows who ran on your city council? Does anybody know who ran for city council here? One? Okay, all right, a couple. 2 weeks ago. Okay, all right, just in time. All right, another question. Who watches Fox, MSNBC, CNN, or reads the New York Times or the Washington Post? Who engages with any of those, watching or reading any of those? Okay, until you hit the paywall. It always gets in the way. Anybody watch local news station or read the local newspapers? Okay, a couple. Okay, that's good. Sign of hope. All right. I was going to change course a little bit now. Who knows who Taylor Swift or Aaron Rodgers are? Come on, everybody knows who they are. This one's a little harder. Who knows both of the neighbors on either side of their house or apartment? Like you actually know their name, you talk to them. Okay, this in the South, it's a little different. In New York, yeah, no. If you talk to your neighbor in New York, they're going to call the police. It's not going to be good. It's true. It's true. Okay, so no, but let's think about this though. This idea that everything is kind of being consolidated, nationalized, and this uprooting from the local, whether it's from knowing your neighbor to reading the local newspaper, knowing about the local politicians in power. Think about the effect that this uprooting and this centralizing has on the way we experience the world around us. So this polemicization, this kind of everything's ideological, one side or the other, the nationalization of media and politics, it distracts us from the concrete issues, the things happening in our own backyards. Thus, we should be looking for ways to get involved, whether that's in our parish, so things like this, the fact that you come to an event hosted by the parish community is one way to start. Also, civic organizations, getting involved in our kids' schools if we're parents, could be talking to local politicians, writing them a letter if there's an issue in your neighborhood, tapping into local news sources if we're not doing that, and being intentional about talking to our neighbors about whatever issues or concerns that they have. And I want to bring it back to the kind of culture shock here. It's interesting that, and if I'm walking down the street in New York, if I say hi to someone, they're going to punch me in the face. You just don't do that. But here, sometimes people will greet you, and I'm a complete stranger to them. I think that's a very hopeful thing. I think we should take the risk of talking to strangers within reason. But it's better to have that kind of culture where you talk to random people around you rather than, everyone's a potential enemy. You're always, watching out. While I was walking out of the morning prayer today, I saw there was a couple that was lost, and they were trying to use the GPS, and some random lady was like, "Hey, do you need directions?" That doesn't happen in New York, but it should happen. That should be a normal thing, that you try to help random strangers out. Another thing, walking around the neighborhood, they had a Jewish food festival over here, and it was super lively, and people were talking. There's the music, the food. So I don't know. I think we need to keep our eyes on these kinds of things in the local community. We need to be looking for ways that we can engage with random people, get to know about their lives, their concerns. We'll see. I've been debating over the last 24 hours. It's an option. It's an option. But yes, does anybody know the term third places? Anyone know what third places are? Yeah, so third places basically, it's a space where you don't work and where you don't live. So whether it's a bar, a cafe, a restaurant, one of these squares, that's another thing that when I have free time, am I just staying longer at work doing overtime? Am I just hiding in my house? When can I just go out into public spaces again and be with people? This is a very simple but kind of crucial way to get back in touch with reality, with the flesh, with the concrete world around us. And again, meeting people, knowing what their concerns are. So again, back on this issue of the nationalization, the globalization of media and politics. I think another thing that we need to focus on is how we can actively be building bridges across ideological divides, forging a culture of encounter, a culture of unity, again, fulfilling Christ's desire that they may all be one. So going out of our way to engage in conversation with people who we know have a different point of view from us, being afraid of unacknowledging what we have in common as human beings made in the image of God, as well as boldly and charitably discussing our disagreements with them. We shouldn't be afraid of this. Doing that, it's a powerful way to break out of this position of being reactionary, of wanting to fight against the problems that we perceive, and shifting towards an attitude of receiving as well as of giving. This position, again, it requires us to wait on God to surprise us. It requires us to kind of step back and realize, if someone disagrees with me, I'm not necessarily going to convince them of everything I believe, but it's also not a solution just to turn away and give up completely. Give God the space to surprise us. Maybe there is some way that he's going to show that we are united, that we have certain not only similar beliefs, but similar experiences as human beings. So I think of the example, there's an American journalist who's living down in Brazil right now. His name is Glenn Greenwald. You may have heard of him. He's very strongly libertarian, but socially he's a little more progressive. He's married to another man there in Brazil. And a few years ago around Christmas time, he wrote an article about this evangelical Christian politician named Cabo Daciolo, who accompanied him and his husband David while he was facing a life-threatening illness in the hospital. So Daciolo was very progressive on social issues and very conservative on cultural ones, and he received a lot of flack in Brazil for his opposition to same-sex marriage. But Greenwald and his husband, they once met this politician at an event, and they became very quick friends. And eventually, Greenwald posted a picture on his Twitter of them with this politician. And a lot of people, sent a lot of hate comments towards them saying, why are you fraternizing with the enemy? This guy's on the other side. And as much as, he may have disagreed with him on certain issues, he affirmed that, this guy was a truly sincere human being and ended up becoming a true friend to him and his husband, David. And so when David was in the hospital, this guy came to visit him several times, offering encouragement, offering prayers, while many of their alleged allies ignored them, never showed up. So I want to read a quote from this article that he wrote after having this experience with Daciolo. So he says, since David was admitted to the ICU 2 months ago, Cabo Daciolo hasn't stopped calling to ask about David, send prayers, give comfort. He went to David's room in the ICU to pray with and for David, including just days before his election day. Few in Brazil's political world would have done as much. It's easy to put various flags and hashtags on your profile, or claim that you believe in political causes, or seek applause by publicly denouncing others as less enlightened than you. Much more meaningful and valuable is what you do in life, how you treat others, the humanity you show. The things you do when no one is looking reflect much more on your values than the slogans you chant and the flags you wave for others. Of course, politics matters, he continues. It matters a lot. It's David's job and mine. But if politics drives you to hate your neighbors and everyone who sees the world differently from you, instead of being angry with centers of powers, then it's playing a very distorted role in your life. I've had David's cell phone number since he's been hospitalized. I've had his cell phone since he's been hospitalized, and it's full of private messages of affection and prayers from people of all parties, of all ideologies. The people who send these messages have nothing to gain from it, only human decency. If you decide to dismiss, or worse, hate everyone who sees the world differently, you are walking a dark and empty path and depriving yourself of valuable opportunities. Politics matter, but by design, it often obscures the common humanity that drives most of us. It is easy in politics to turn others into cartoons and caricatures. We now interact with the world via a computerized network, which allow us to see others as digitized characters on a screen rather than as human beings. Our family crisis has taught me a lot, and I'm grateful to Cabo for helping with that. So again, how often do you see this in the mass media and the news, somebody having this kind of encounter with their political so-called enemy? So I think this is something we should look at, how can we go out of our way, especially as people of faith, to really be there for people, to witness to their humanity, to kind of share each other's suffering, even with our differences. Briefly, there's another example from the media that kind of shocked me. It was on MSNBC. Rachel Maddow is a very popular host on there, and this was back in 2001. She did a special report on, it was March 3rd, 2021, my bad. She did a special report on two events that coincided on that day. The first was, there's this Korean War chaplain, Father Emil Capone. I think he was a Roman Catholic priest. And he went out of his way to take care of the army, the soldiers that he was, called to be a chaplain to, and ended up dying because of all the ways he went out of his way, giving up food for them, giving up his safety, his comfort. And after 70 years of his death, the army finally found his remains and awarded him the Medal of Honor. So that same day, Pope Francis went to visit the Christian communities in Iraq, which is something that has never happened before. There's never been a Catholic Pope that's gone to visit Iraq because of obviously plenty of reasons. And Rachel Maddow, who she's not particularly religious, known as, a very vocal progressive, but she said, I want to read this quote from her. So she says, so things that seem impossible seem that way because they are hard to fix, because they are hard to find a way through. But sometimes twice in a day, an impossible thing breaks open, becomes real, becomes a fact, becomes today's news. And for me in the news, Days like that are an absolute cure for the million stick in the mud, nothing is going to go better Votorama days that come in between like this. Sometimes the impossible really does just happen. Be ready. So, I mean, that's crazy that someone on one of these like major news outlets, who again is very political, recognizes this kind of miracle happening. How is it that on the same day, these two witnesses of, something truly human is happening? And again, her advice, sometimes the impossible does happen. We need to be ready for it. We can't block out this possibility. And it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. If we're only focused on our own effort, how we're going to create a solution to everything, if we don't create that space to wait on God, it's not going to happen. So how can we, like she said, be ready for the impossible? How can we cultivate that kind of space? So just to wrap things up, I've tried to implement these attitudes, these practices, these goals into my own journey. And I find that, ultimately what gives me the most hope is that both God and the law that it's written on our hearts, the way that he created us, they remain constant. So no matter what's going on in the world, no matter how much we get entrenched in this kind of virtual reality, we get disconnected from ourselves, from our neighbor, God is still there. Our heart is still there. Nothing really changes that. We can get distracted from it, but it's still there. No matter what dark, confusing forces plague our society, nothing is going to trump this fact. And as I've held on to that realization, I find that God continues to surprise me in the midst of all the cultural and political messes that I see going on in this simulational age. So last thing I'm going to say to wrap it up, another pop culture reference. Has anyone seen Martin Scorsese's film Silence? This one, everybody needs to put that on the list. So his film Silence was based on a novel, which is based on these Portuguese martyrs who went to Japan, I think it was 1500s, but underwent really brutal torture, were martyred. And the main character in this film was played by Andrew Garfield, Spider-Man. Now, again, so this guy is not a particularly religious person, but in order to prepare for this role playing a priest, he did the 30-day Ignatian exercises. So this is something that Jesuit priests do. It's a 30-day retreat where, it's very austere. You're really focused on contemplative prayer. He even lost 40 pounds doing it because he was, fasting a lot. But he found two things while preparing for this role, while spending 30 days in prayer. The first thing is how terrifying silence itself can be. The fact that we have all these distractions around us. Like, if you actually stop and listen and pay attention, it can be scary because feelings, questions, thoughts will come up that we don't know how to resolve. So that's why this is so attractive. It's not just because, they're trying to make a buck off of us with all the ads and all that. It's that, if we actually pay attention to reality, to our hearts, to other people, we realize that we can't save ourselves. We don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. But for him, really taking that risk of going into the silence, really spending those 30 days in prayer, started out scary, but became something really liberating. But then this is the really incredible thing to me that, I want to quote his words himself. So what he said while he was doing this retreat, which is very much focused on the Gospels and meditating on Jesus's actual life. So he said, what was really easy was falling in love with this person, was falling in love with Jesus Christ. And again, this is someone who's not a believer. That was the most surprising thing, God. That was the most remarkable thing, falling in love, and how easy it was to fall in love with Jesus. The main thing that I wanted to heal, that I brought to Jesus, that I brought to the exercises, was this feeling of not enoughness, as he says, not being enough. This feeling of that forever longing for the perfect expression of this thing that is inside each of us, that wound of not enoughness. That wound of feeling like what I have to offer is never enough. And he finished in this interview saying, I'm praying that I'm freer to offer myself vulnerably, and that these other voices, whether they're internal or external, don't have the same power over that flame, over the ability to offer that purest, vulnerable, cracked open heart, in service of God, in service of the greater good, in service of love, in service of the divine. I feel like this is what God is showing me. So I just want to close with this image, again, of someone who's not particularly religious, very successful, but who recognizes that if you really pay attention. If you create this space, God will surprise us. So I invite us to think about these things, to think about the ways that we're going to allow God the space to surprise us in our neighbor, in our local communities, in our own personal lives. Thank you.